Good afternoon. Thank you for coming back. I wish you all had a good lunch and enjoyed the plenary talk this morning. We will have two more plenary talks this afternoon, which will be delivered by Dr. Stuart Pimm and Dr. Ruth de Vries. Please be seated, and we are going to start really soon. Again, here is a gentle reminder. Please silence your phone during the symposium, and please note that we will have happy hour with the speakers at 5:30 at Rebel today. So please come over for chit-chatting, to discuss science, and to know more about our speakers. It took me like 2 to 3 hours to look at Dr. Pimm's CV, and trying my best to convert it into a 3-minute introductory speech. First of all, let me thank Dr. Pimm for accepting this invitation to come over and speak at Texas A&M University. And it is our honor to have you here as one of our plenary speakers today. Dr. Stuart Pimm is a Doris Duke Professor of Conservation Ecology at Duke University. For your information, this is one of the most prestigious chairs at Duke University. Dr. Pimm received his bachelor from University of Oxford, England, and his PhD from New Mexico State University in 1974. He is the author of many scientific papers about conserving species and how to prevent extinction. He also published many papers examining the food web, where Dr. Pimm is a co-founder of this field. He also studied some fundamental ecological topics such as stability and complexity of ecosystem. It is estimated that he had published more than 300 scientific papers, and quite a number of them were in Nature, Science, PNAS, and Ecology, just to name a few. Now, if you look at his Google citation, Dr. Pimm is cited more than 25,000 times. He is also a prolific writer, having authored 5 books. His book includes The Balance of Nature, and this book has been cited more than 2,000 times alone, and it is a book with impact factor. In 2001, he published another book called The World According to Pimm, Dr. Pimm, and a scientist audit the Earth. Other than that, he also published articles in Scientific American and is a regular contributor to National Geographic. He has many research programs around the world, including the area in Caribbean, Central America, Brazil, and Madagascar, as well as Everglades in Florida. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Art and Sciences, the recipient of the 2000 Heineken Prize for Environmental Sciences. And for your information again, it is one of the most prestigious international awards in the field. And the prize was delivered by the Prince of the Netherlands at that time, who is now the King of Netherlands. He is also the winner of the Tyler Environmental Prize in 2010. And for your information, the past recipients of this prize include prominent ecologists such as Eugene Autumn, E.O. Wilson, Jane Goodall, Paul Ehrlich, and many other world-class ecologists. Dr. Pimm is also the chair for an NGO called SavingSpecies.org, and this organization aims to conserve biodiversity using the best science and technology available to help connect, protect, and restore habitat that will prevent further species extinction. So without further ado, please join me to welcome Dr. Stuart Pimm with his talk entitled, What Must We Know About Diversity to Conserve It? Thank you.
I too would like to thank the committee for organising this and inviting me. This is an extraordinarily well-run symposium. Thank you all for doing such a wonderful job. So I want to ask a question about whether the science that we do makes any difference. We all enjoy science, we all get a kick out of studying things, but really does it make a difference in the world? I think that's an essential, vital question for a field like conservation, which is clearly mission-driven. The job in conservation is to prevent the loss of biodiversity. And you know, the bingos, the big NGOs, seem to have answered that question with a fairly emphatic no. A couple of years ago, World Wildlife Fund decided to get rid of essentially all of its scientific staff on the grounds that they were too expensive. They were consuming 2% of their annual budget. And then we have this most extraordinary quote from the then chief scientist at the Nature Conservancy. I hope you can read it. I have trouble reading it because it has words that have far more syllables than I am used to being able to pronounce. But I think it means that national parks are not a good idea. So with those sort of rather discouraging notions about whether science makes a difference, I want to examine the question of, what has conservation science done for you recently? Well, the story so far is this. We know that species extinctions are running 1,000 times faster than they should be. We know this because Al Gore says so in An Inconvenient Truth. And you might think, well, from whom did Al Gore get this wisdom? And the answer is, well, me. At least colleagues and me in a paper that we published in Science 20 years ago, a review article in Science. We've updated this last year, 2 years ago. Species extinctions are increasing. They're irreversible, of course. They are geographically concentrated, and they are mostly taking place in the tropical moist forests of the world. I'll expand on that idea in a little bit. So, what does the science that we have tell us about this process of extinction? We always think of biodiversity as being birds and butterflies and the like. But biodiversity includes our own social, cultural, linguistic diversity. And these two friends of mine, the Guarani from Ecuador, in their finest, represent a group of peoples who made first contact in their lifetimes. They were young people when they made first contact with the outside world. And this figure from a paper by my former student, Lisa Manner, shows the diversity of languages spoken within the New World. That we are not only eliminating species, we are eliminating cultures and languages and peoples. And we ought not to forget that side of biodiversity. If we look at what's happening to the world's tropical forests, this figure from my colleague Clinton Jenkins gives you some idea for the Americas. Once upon a time, Brazil had two large rainforests, the Amazon, which everybody knows about, and the Mata Atlântica, the coastal forest, which few people know about, but it's there. It's 1 million square kilometers. If you look at how much of that forest is away from an edge, a kilometer or more from the edge of that forest, you can see that most of the Atlantic coast forest has now been cut up into tiny little pieces, even when the forest remains. The Amazon is getting that way. We are dramatically reducing the world's tropical forests. So, how do we connect land use change, not just tropical forests, but other land use changes, to the loss of biological diversity? Well, I want to use the word law in perfectly good sense. It's in the Oxford English Dictionary. It's a way that it was used more extensively in the 19th century, but we still use it today when we talk about, the law of gravity. I mean, if I wanted to illustrate the law of gravity, I might want to let this go and let it drop. I won't because I might break it, but you get the idea. You know what's going to happen if I let it drop. And that sense of looking for patterns, for generalities, is the sense in which I want to use the word law. And the first law of biodiversity comes from the remarkable paper, usually called the Sarawak Law paper, that Alfred Russel Wallace published many years ago. Wallace was a collector. He funded his research by going and collecting butterflies and beetles and other things in remote parts of the world, sending them back to discerning Victorian collectors who like to keep them in their specimen cabinets. So he was somebody who thought very carefully about biodiversity. And in a paper short enough that he could have published it in Nature, he defines the two laws of evolution. Every species is coming to existence, coincident both in space and time, with a pre-existing closely allied species. In other words, you don't find trilobites in the Cambrian, the Jurassic, and the Eocene. You find trilobites together in time. And you don't find polar bears at the North Pole, on the Tibetan Plateau, and in Antarctica. You find polar bears in a sort of a continuous habitat. And you realize that those were the two laws, the two generalities of biodiversity that we needed to explain. He published that paper, nobody took any notice of it. And you probably know the story that when he finally came up with the explanation for that, what we call natural selection, he basically wrote this letter to the only person who might care, which was Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin had a oh hell moment when he realized that he'd been scooped. But that's a story that I don't have time to tell today. So these are also the first laws of biodiversity, but there are others. The next one is to describe species' geographical ranges. If we were to line up species from the one with the smallest range to the largest range, and then put that number scaled to 100% on the y-axis, and then plot the range across the x-axis, you get this. This is the cumulative range distributions of birds. It's something like 25% of all birds, 0.25 of all birds, have a geographical range that's something on the order of 10 to the 4, about a little bit more than 10,000 square kilometers. 50% of all birds have ranges about 200,000 square kilometers. The actual data are in red, and the black line is a simple log normal fit to these data. Just fitted a very simple log normal distribution to that two parameters. So it's a remarkably good description. And what this means is that there are a quite extraordinary number of species that have small geographical ranges. We are used to, we are familiar with species that have large ranges. There are grackles, there are mockingbirds feeding outside on this university campus. I have mockingbirds and grackles feeding in my garden in Key Largo and in my garden in North Carolina. Species with huge geographical ranges. We're all familiar with them. But the reality is that they are not the majority of species. The majority of species, at least half of all species, have very, very tiny geographical ranges. Well, is this a law? Those are data for flowering plants, for cone shells and marine genus, amphibians, terrestrial birds, terrestrial mammals. And you can see that half of all terrestrial mammals have geographical range sizes less than 115,000 square kilometers. Half of all amphibians have a range size less than 4,000 square kilometers. 25% of amphibians have ranges less than 100 square kilometres. That's probably about the size of the Texas A&M campus. So you get the idea. There's a large number of species with tiny geographical ranges. The interesting thing about this is that we are still uncovering species with small ranges. These are amphibians from Brazil, from South America. If you look at the number of species, it's easier to look at the cumulative numbers, the red line. 20,000 square kilometres is a minimum threshold. If you live in a place that's suffering habitat loss and you have a range of less than 20,000 square kilometres, IUCN will deem you as being threatened. The number of species known to have such a small geographical range has essentially doubled in the last 30 years. We are still discovering species with tiny ranges. We do not describe species with big ranges. Linnaeus did that a long time ago. So we are still uncovering even more species with tiny geographical ranges. Now, the third law of biodiversity, there is no really polite way of saying this. It's the Mother Nature is a bitch law. You might think that if you're a species that only occurs in a small area, that's your area, that's your patch, that's your domain, and damn it, you're going to be common there. In fact, it's the other way around. Species with small geographical ranges tend to be rare within them, whereas species with large geographical ranges, mockingbirds and grackles, tend to be common within those ranges. This is a pattern that occurs on all scales, in all taxa. So that the bird on the right, the little sparrow on the right, is one of the commonest birds from Mexico down to Tierra del Fuego. That obscure little green bird on the left is the grey-winged cotinga. That's not just any photograph of the grey-winged cotinga. That's the first photograph ever taken of it in the field, and I nearly died getting it because I had to take a helicopter to a remote mountaintop looking for it. The helicopter was supposed to come back 3 days later. It didn't. Obviously I did, and you can read about the story in my National Geographic blog. This bird has a tiny range, and it's really bloody hard to find it even when you get there. So, species, lots of small range species, lots of species that have small ranges and are rare within them. The next two laws are, well, the law number 4 is pretty obvious. Some areas have a lot more species than others. And particularly the tropical moist forests of the world have very many more species than other places. But when you look at where species with small geographical ranges are, you get very, very different patterns. It's not what you'd expect. You might think where there are more species, of everything, there'll be more species with big ranges, more species with middle-sized ranges, more species with tiny ranges. It isn't that way.
The number of species of birds and mammals and amphibians we can now map out with some considerable detail. These are birds, and they show that the greatest numbers of species are in the tropical moist forests of the world, a pattern that covers all the continents. The interesting and unusual aspect, however, is when we begin to look at species in terms of their geographical range sizes, and look at the species that have smaller than the median range. those distributions are profoundly different. They are concentrated in special places, what my colleague Norma Myers calls hotspots. And the northern Andes is a hotspot with extraordinary numbers of small range species.
Now, the thing you need to know about small range species is that if you have a small range, you are much more likely to go extinct or be on the verge of going extinct. The risk of extinction increases dramatically as ranges become small. And we've known for a long time that island species contribute to the list of species that have gone extinct. It was working in Hawaii in the late 70s and 80s that made me a conservation biologist. But it's not just islands. Species that have small ranges in mainland areas, particularly lowland areas of mainlands, are even more at risk given the given range size than are species on islands. So small range means vulnerability to extinction. Small range species, there's a lot of them, they tend to be rare within those ranges, and they tend to be vulnerable. Now, I do want to make it clear, there are two kinds of threatened species, broadly. If we plot out where threatened mammals are, for example, again these maps are from the site biodiversitymapping.org, which I highly commend to you. If you look at where threatened mammals are, there are clearly large areas of Africa, for example, where there are threatened mammals like lions. This is not a small range species. The original range of a lion was probably something on the order of 20 million square kilometres. It's threatened because it's big, it's predatory, it gets in people's way, it comes into human conflict. I have to say, I feel, as a fellow Aggie, I'm very proud to be a New Mexico Aggie, but I've noticed something about this auditorium, that it is improperly protected. You have two lions outside this auditorium. They are the wrong way round. Instead of being like that, they should be like that. And awful things will befall you if you don't fix your damn lions. Especially as they're close to this enormous temple to American culture, your football stadium. So I'm warning you. So we have lions, right? And they are an example of what in fact are about 10% of the world's species. About 10% of the world's threatened species are things that have big ranges. Lions and tigers and bears and as Doris says in The Wizard of Oz, sharks, bluefin tuna, things like that, things with huge ranges that are hunted, all the rest of it. But about 90% of all the threatened species are these species with small geographical ranges, like this lovely little tamarin on the right, so that when you actually look at a map of where threatened mammals are and where small range mammals are, there is a high degree of overlap. Biodiversity is in a lot of different places if they're warm and wet. It's in these special places if they have small geographical ranges. And those are the places where the majority of threatened species are. So if you look at that bottom right map, Northern Andes, coastal Brazil, Madagascar, Southeast Asia, and so on. Norma Myers biodiversity hotspots. And of course what happens if you take the collision of deforestation, the areas shown in red up there are the areas that are deforested, in green where the remaining forests are. If you look at where there's been tropical deforestation, you look at where small range species are, you look at where those collide, that's where you find species at risk of extinction. All right, given that, what can we do? I've now giving you the science that allows us to sort of concentrate on about 10% of the Earth's surface. that's still, 10 million square kilometers. We still want to be able to downscale to the actions where practical conservation is going to make a difference. And I'm going to give you 3 very, very different case studies. One from Brazil, from the Mata Atlântica, the coastal forests, the second from the US, and the third from China. If you look at a satellite image of coastal Brazil, these are 3 Landsat images, so that's about 500 kilometers east to west. You can see that even this part of Brazil, which has more forest than anywhere else on the coastal forest, a lot of the forest is gone. It's not all green. If you zoom in on this particular piece of it, that embayment is Guanabara Bay. This is where the city of Rio de Janeiro is. If you look at that, where I have classified the forest in this particularly lurid day-glow green, if you look at that, you notice that there's a lot of forest that's in little pieces. And we can take out all the pieces that are smaller than 100 hectares, 1 square kilometre. That's that. What I've done there is to remove all the pieces of forest that are smaller than 100 hectares. And you think, that's a lot of forest. And in fact, it's about 15% of the forest area. So we've not only lost the forest, but we've fragmented the forest. That's what it looks like on the ground. Lots of forest in little pieces. What we can do now is to combine our knowledge of where species are. We can stack up those geographical ranges. We can realize that these are forest species, so they're not going to occur in places that don't have forest or where the forest is in too small a group of pieces. And you can come up with a map of where the greatest number of threatened species are. This is now a tactical map. This is a map that says we can look at this area and identify the precise area where there is the largest number of species at risk of extinction. We know something about fragments, thanks to what I consider to be the most extraordinary ecological experiment ever done, at least intentionally done. It's done by Tom Lovejoy. It's now pushing 40 years. Tom realized that an area of the Amazon was going to be deforested, and so he was able to set up a study to monitor the rate at which fragments would be lost. Species would be lost from the fragments that were created by the deforestation. It's a satellite image. You can see there are fragments of different sizes. There's a lot of 1 hectare fragments, some 10 hectare fragments, a few 100 hectare fragments, one 10,000 hectare fragment. The basic idea that Tom had was we could follow the rate at which species were lost from these fragments, and we could begin to understand the dynamic of fragmentation. Very roughly, what we see is small fragments lose more species, and they lose them faster. And indeed, even fragments of 100 hectares, a square kilometre, have lost, something like 50% of their species within a little more than a decade. I combine these data with data collected by my former graduate student, Tom Brooks, who's now at IUCN. So Tom and I put these data together with the study that we did with my other graduate student, Gonzalo Ferraz, from the Amazon. And we can come up with a broad law, if you like, of biodiversity loss scaling. How long does it take to lose half the species? It's a matter of a few years for fragments of a hectare. It's a matter of maybe 10, 20 years for 100 hectares. Even for 1,000 hectares, you're still losing half your species within, 40, 50, 60 years. That gives us a sense of how big fragments have to be if they're not going to lose their species. It also tells us how quickly we need to act.
The greatest species diversity is found in the tropical moist forests of the world, and bird species are an example of this, with high concentrations of birds in the Amazon, tropical Africa, Southeast Asia. The greatest number of threatened species, however, is where geographical small ranges collide with excessive deforestation. A good example of this is the coastal forests of Brazil. We can map out in some considerable detail where those species are likely to live. This particular image plots the remaining forest against elevation and colour codes the image by how many threatened species remain in these places. All of these images are courtesy of my colleague Clinton Jenkins. If we want to understand why there are so many threatened species here, one can look at the remote sensing. This is a landscape that is extraordinarily fragmented. These patches of forest, tiny and isolated, contain the largest number of threatened species in the Americas. The obvious question is what we can do about this. When faced with these images, I felt that everything we know about the loss of biodiversity from fragments suggests that the most effective conservation action would be to reconnect those fragments. As we close in on this image, the quality of the grazing land here is all too obvious. You can see the brown lateritic soils shining through. This is extremely bad land. Bad land, of course, means that it's cheap to purchase. It can grow carbon cheaper than it can grow cattle. The need to reconnect these patches is not just limited to birds. The area on the right is Heavy now, a nature reserve, and it's the home to the golden lion tamarin, a charismatic little monkey that has been rescued from the very brink of extinction. The tamarins want to go forth and multiply, and to do that they have to cross this gap. And what you're seeing now is how this gap has changed in the years since my group, Saving Species, purchased the land. You can see that that gap is becoming greener. In this image, it's quite clearly a lot greener than it was historically. And that's because we have removed the cattle from this area. We've planted trees, we've restored the land, and the forest is beginning to come back. So who is the we? My organisation, SavingSpecies.org, raised the money. We gave that money to a Brazilian NGO, the Golden Lion Tamarin Association, who bought the land and then handed that land over to the Instituto Chica Mendes, essentially the Brazilian parts. The Tamarin Association is also doing these plantings, so you can see the forest coming back at really quite a remarkable rate.
I have no shame, we use child labour. Here are the children from the local school planting trees, and my next video clip is going to be taken exactly where this image was taken about 6 years later.
We have not just merely destroyed so much of the world's tropical forests. What we have left behind is in tatters, in fragments. Those fragments are often too small for species to maintain viable populations. There just aren't enough males to go around for the females and females to go around for the males. And of all the places, all the fragments, one that I thought was particularly tragic was the one immediately behind me. This is the Union Biological Reserve in Coastal Reserve, about 100 miles east of the city of Rio de Janeiro. Because in this isolated patch of forest are a whole load of species on the brink of extinction, the most charismatic of which is a beautiful little monkey called the golden lion tamarin. And the golden lion tamarins in that fragment could not go forth and multiply into the forest over there because there was the cattle pasture behind me. And when I saw that cattle pasture for the first time about 8 years ago, a cattle pasture just like the one I'm standing in, I thought, it has to go. And so, we have made it go away. This is a restored forest. I helped raise money for my friends at the Asociación Hijo León Dorado, the Golden Lion Tamarin Association. I've planted this forest, and it now connects that once isolated fragment of forest in the Union Biological Reserve to a much larger area of forest over in this direction. It's what we call the biological corridor, and it means that the golden lion tamarins that were once imprisoned in this forest island, this forest fragment behind me, can now cross through these small but growing trees and go and find new habitats, new homes, new places for their tamarin families. There's something else that's important about this fragment too. When you have small fragments, the ecological balance gets out of whack. And one of the things that happens in small fragments is that you lose the top predators. You lose the pumas, you lose the jaguars, because they too cannot cross, in this case, from the big forest over there to the fragment behind me. One of the most exciting discoveries this year was, well, how do I put it politely, puma poop. And the puma poop in the forest behind me means that the pumas are coming back into the forest that was once isolated. The pumas rule. They are the top predators, and they keep down the smaller predators, which, if left uncontrolled, can have a devastating effect on small birds, on golden lion tamarins, and other things as well. What you're seeing here is ecological healing. We've gone from a cattle pasture that was a barrier to the forest species to a landscape that is healing, is restoring. We are re-establishing its connectivity. With that, the tamarins, the pumas, and all their friends will come back, and indeed they are coming back.
So, as an example of what this area looks like, this is what it looked like before we made the purchase, a very degraded cattle pasture, and this is what it looked like about 3 years ago. I haven't been to the site in about a year. It's even more impressive, but you can see that the forest is beginning to fill in this valley. It's a lovely image on Google Earth too. That was the original barrier, the cattle pasture that isolated the fragment, and as you can see, it's now filling in very satisfactorily with forest. My second example, I want to talk about the US. I want to talk about how we set conservation priorities. We are the world capital of salamanders. You know, we should embrace salamanders. We have most of them. Let's hear it for salamanders. My colleagues and I wanted to look at how we were protecting our own biodiversity. And so we decided to look at, where the protected areas were and where the protected areas ought to be. And so we map out, in the way that we have begun to do quite routinely, a set of maps on the left of how many species there are, mammals and birds and amphibians and reptiles and freshwater fish and trees. And then we look at which species are endemic, which are the species that we uniquely have responsibility for. And you can see, very consistently, that the southeast is important for mammals and birds and amphibians and reptiles, especially freshwater fish and trees. We have a lot of unique species that are found uniquely within the United States and uniquely within the southeast. These are birds, mammals and amphibians, looking at species that globally have small ranges, i.e. less than median size, and species that are small ranged within the US, and then species that are threatened. You certainly see there's an extraordinary amount of biodiversity in the west, particularly along the Mexican border. But begin to look at the distribution of species, we see that the east, the southeast, and Texas are extremely important for globally threatened species. So how well are we protecting our biodiversity? First of all, you can look at where we have set aside national parks. Overall, as a nation, we have done quite well. But it's because we have protected the West and not protected the East. Apart from Big Bend, there are almost no protected areas in Texas. Apart from the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, there aren't many protected areas in the East. Certainly in North Carolina, the Everglades is protected in Florida. But we have generally not allocated land to protection in the eastern United States. That's where the biodiversity is. That's where the unique biodiversity is. So, if we look at species, and we have defined something like 8 priority areas here. These we define as areas that are rich in endemic species, so it includes the Edwards Plateau of Texas. It includes the Florida Keys, it includes a lot of the southern Appalachians, North Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, coastal plain, as well as places in California. If you look at those places, we have considered them to be priorities because there are substantial numbers of species there that are completely, inadequately protected. Well, what about the private sector? What about NGOs? What about organizations whose mission is to protect biodiversity? Land trusts. Well, the answer is that they have protected a lot of the eastern United States. Where have they spent most money? Places like Connecticut. I have nothing nice to say about Connecticut. I have no intention of wanting to go and work at that university there, which is in a scruffy port city, not when I'm a professor at Duke. You know, I mean, come on, who cares about Connecticut? And I know some of you may have come from there and you're going to be very hurt and upset. You know, Connecticut could fall off the map tomorrow. And who would care? I care about Texas. I have to say I'm not greatly fond of what I learned to call the Lana Estacada when I was at Texas Tech. But you know what? Central Texas is really significant, and so are many places in the east. The big conservation organizations like the Nature Conservancy have done an extraordinarily poor job of setting national priorities. Now, I have a lot of friends, a lot of former students, at regional offices with TNC. They are wonderful people. I think they do an outstanding job. On a state-by-state basis, TNC is a very impressive organization. But its national leadership is dismal, because it has basically said there's more money in Connecticut and there's less money, you know, in the Southern Appalachians, so the Southern Appalachians get a hell. It should not be that way if the organization views itself as being a national organization. We need to pay attention to these priority areas because they contain our unique biodiversity. And we did this study in very large part because we were giving lots of advice to lots of other countries about how to protect their biodiversity, and we thought, well, we bloody well look at what we're doing and need to have a really close and detailed look at whether we're doing the right things, and broadly we're not. We understand that the opportunities for national parks in the east are limited, but there are some. Some of these areas are national forests, and protecting them as national parks would make a big difference to species protection. There are extraordinary opportunities for private individuals. A private initiative is helping to protect some of the areas shown in letter number 5. There's a lot more we as a nation could be doing. My final example is China. Now, we've all heard of the notion of an umbrella species. The idea that if you protect some charismatic animal, that other species will be protected under its, umbrella. It's a great ecological idea, and it's really, when you think about it, a bit silly. Because nobody's ever really done that. Nobody's ever said, let's go out and protect this species as a conscious action. And then, what do we get as a benefit? I mean, we've set aside national parks, and, Yellowstone, we set aside Yellowstone, and, sure, if you protect bison there, you're protecting the park. But that's not why Yellowstone was set up. But, in China, the Chinese government has very deliberately, very carefully, very thoughtfully gone out and protected a very, very large amount of Western China just for the panda. It's panda-oriented conservation. They are using the panda as their metric, as their measure, as their icon. So the question that my Chinese colleague, Bingbing Li, and I decided to look at was how many other species in China benefited from this conscious, deliberate decision by the Chinese government to protect pandas. And did it do a good job? Did it do a bad job? Could it be a better job? What advice could we give to the Chinese authorities to encourage them to meet their commitments under the Aichi targets, under the targets that international organizations have agreed to protect more of the land? We wanted to know, how well have you done? Where can you go in the future? So, if you look at same sorts of maps where threatened mammals are in the world, Southeast Asia has an unusually large number of threatened mammals. So mammals are, a potentially important part of this assessment. And China has a lot of other very impressive mammals. Taken this golden snub-nosed monkey. And both these species are indeed in the same habitats as pandas. If you look at where China has allocated its protected areas, it's done exactly what the US has done. It's put most of its protected areas out in the west, in the dry and the cold areas of China, and relatively few areas are within the forested areas of China. But that middle map of the triptych at the top is a map of where forests are, and it has protected some significant areas of forest, and it has done so to protect pandas. So we can do the same sort of process as now ought to be familiar to you. We look at where all the species of mammals, birds and amphibians are, where the endemic species are, where the endemic forest species are. There's also areas of endemic non-forest species. That's sort of a side thing to this talk. And you will see that there's an area in the west of China, in the middle of China, when you include the Tibetan Plateau, that has a large concentration of endemic birds and mammals and amphibians. Well, why birds, mammals and amphibians, talk after talk after talk? That's because we have global ranges for most of the species. The reptile people, if you are a reptile person, shame, humiliation. You have been promising maps of reptiles for more than a decade. We are still waiting. And I know what you're saying. You're saying they're not perfect. Maps never are. Get over it. Because the moment you publish an imperfect map, somebody will correct it. If you don't publish an imperfect map, nobody will. We basically have to go with what we've got. So, that is the range of the giant panda. That is a map of the biodiversity of endemic species of birds and mammals and amphibians in China. And you see, ooh, that's, oh, in fact I slid the map across by mistake. They line up. So let's look at it in a little bit more detail. The mountains to the west and to the north of Sichuan and in Gansu and Shaanxi. The blue areas are panda habitat. The other colours, green, yellow and red, are priority areas for 1 or 2 or 3 sets of species. Green means either birds or mammals or amphibians. Yellow means 2, red means 3. And you can see very broadly there's a really good match between the areas that the Chinese government has set aside for pandas in the last decade and the areas that are priority areas for conservation. Now, it's not perfect. Something like 70% of the endemic species in China are protected by the Chinese government's commitment to protecting pandas. But we came up with some very specific tactical suggestions for areas where the Chinese could protect other species, like the golden snub-nosed monkey and the taking, areas that are still forested, still not under threat, but which would clearly benefit from greater protection. So this is not just some intellectual exercise. This is built into a process of advising our colleagues in that manage national nature reserves in China to encourage some areas to be given better protection, others areas to be given protection. So I know what you're thinking. And you're thinking, what am I going to buy somebody I love for Christmas?
This holiday season, think of carbon in the most beautiful form. Diamonds are beautiful, but this year, think of giving her some carbon that's even more valuable. Sequester her carbon in tropical rainforest. For very little money, you can offset your carbon footprint by restoring key habitats in some of the most biologically diverse areas in the world. Visit SavingSpecies.org.
So we at Saving Species accept all credit cards, PayPal. We have a board that has more scientists on it than all the bingos do put together. You may recognise Ed Wilson, Tom Lovejoy, me, Peter Raven, Pat Wright, winner of the last Indianapolis Prize, Trevor Price. We are committed to using conservation science to prevent extinctions. You too can offset your carbon sin. As Texans, you sin more than anybody else in the world when it comes to your carbon emissions. I can't absolve your other sins, but a suitable donation to Saving Species will ensure that when you go to the pearly gates, carbon sin will not be on the list of transgressions. Thank you very much.